Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Greg, for the introduction. So, Gary Harbison, I've been in Monsanto about 6 years. Our team is responsible for cybersecurity, privacy, and business continuity globally in Monsanto. Everybody in here is from St. Louis pretty much, so you guys probably know Monsanto. Global agriculture company. We operate in about 68 countries. Focus mostly on seeds, agriculture, chemical products, as well as data-driven agronomic services and advice for farmers. So in other words, helping farmers get more out of every acre of land and produce more food. So, and we were just talking outside, one of the things, even growing up around agriculture, that I was amazed at when I went to Monsanto was just how much innovation there was, how scientific it was. It's very data-driven in terms of how we're trying to innovate and really drive capabilities forward. And what that's driven, along with some of the threat profile we have in terms of the various adversaries we deal with, is really understanding a lot of the changes that are coming at us, not only from our business strategy, but from threats, as well as just evolving IT capabilities. And it's driven us to spend a lot of time trying to go more into the future. So it'll be a little different topic from the past one, which got pretty technical. But looking at really what are the big shifts in the security industry that we need to be looking at in terms of being ready for tomorrow. And in a lot of discussions with peers and some folks in the room, this is a set of strategies that we've put together to really try and prepare ourselves for what's coming tomorrow.
So the thing with the start.
This slide, and I don't have to cover a lot of this with folks in this room, but you heard what Dimitri said in the discussion before, but threats are just becoming more and more sophisticated, and they're increasing in velocity. And if you look at 2014 as being a record-setting year in terms of data breaches, 2015 I think eclipsed that halfway through the year, especially as you look at OPM and some of those. And overall, when I talk to people outside of the security industry and people I live around, people just don't really know what to do. It's that concept of kind of breach fatigue. And just show of hands in the room, how many people got a replacement credit card or a letter for credit monitoring capacity? How many got multiple of them? And we at least have some understanding of what the companies are going through and the challenges they're up against. But for non-security people, they're just kind of ready to give up. They just expect the letters to come. It's becoming less of a big deal for them. So it's really looking at how do we start to tackle some of these threats. And, even the whole Ashley Madison, breach, and at the beginning that didn't seem like much, but there's been just a lot of drama unfolding in terms of the results out of that. And show of hands, how many had an Ashley Madison account? Too much information. But, that really, just for something that seemed really basic at first, the amount of ways attackers have exploited that information and what that's brought to light has just been a bit fascinating. On the flip side, you also just have the pace of technology change. You've got the whole social, mobile, analytics, cloud. People want to move into more of an agile, continuous delivery type of model. We want to put IT products out faster. We want to innovate. We want to go to IoT, put more devices connected to the internet, generating more data. And we'll come back and figure out how to secure those devices later. And we'll figure out who owns that data and what are the privacy concerns. But, companies see all these capabilities and they're just ready to take advantage of it. And they're looking to us to help them get there because at the same time, you have a lot of visibility being built at the board level and the executive level. The National Association of Corporate Directors put out a handbook on informing board members of their liabilities around cybersecurity if they're not asking the right questions at board meetings. So you've got executives saying, I got the board on me to make sure we're doing the right thing, but we've got to move the company forward and we want to take advantage of all these new technologies. So security people, you guys have to figure out how to get you there but keep you safe. And it's a tall order with the speed at which things are moving today. And it's probably the most rewarding time to be in security, but it's also the most challenging. And on top of that, if you look at really the supply of qualified, talented cybersecurity professionals professionals like what's in this room today, it's not near what we need in terms of companies continuing to do this. So we've got some of our biggest challenges in front of us that need our most talented people to solve, but we're stretching our most talented people thin. And it's really looking at how do we start to tackle that. And we bucketed some thoughts into three main areas, which is how do we stay very risk-based and focus on what's most important, the biggest challenges, the biggest risks. Make sure we're being data-driven and selective about how we prioritize what we work on and what we're working towards, and very people-centered. And we'll talk a little bit more about those three buckets and some of the strategies in there. But this is, again, a collection of ideas and strategies that can really help us deal with the challenges from those first few slides. We spent a lot of time on this slide and looking at, if we look at 2020, 2025, what are IT environments going to look like? And some of you out there may look more like this today than others, but overall, as our data center becomes one of those small circles out there, and our IT environment is a collection of multiple perimeters, multiple infrastructures hosted by multiple vendors and partners. And there's more and more devices collecting data. And how do we need to adapt the controls we use today and the processes we use today to secure those to be ready? And it's not possible for everything yet. So how do we as security professionals get behind an aligned vision and be able to help a lot of the vendor partners develop the capabilities we need? So some examples that we've come up with. How do we get to where networks are really providing connectivity for people and that we don't make trust decisions based on what network you're connected to? Now this has been a flawed model that's difficult to trust for many years, but we haven't really moved on from that because there hasn't been anything better. How do we start to make those trust decisions based on an identity and what context you can have around that? So who are you and what credentials can I gather and what additional context around that, whether that be time you're connecting, the device you're connecting from, your normal behavioral habits, give me a higher level of assurance that it's really you, and then make those decisions on what you should get access to. How do we get to where security controls are going to follow data? Today the model is we will run around and try and assess the security of every one of those cloud environments and every one of those devices that our data may flow through. And overall, I don't think we can keep up today. But as that continues to grow, our data is going to flow through areas that we don't have eyes on. So how do we start to finally make that dream of DRM? It's been like chasing a unicorn for 5 years, but how do we get to where that's a reality? And wherever that data flows, it's got security controls built in there, and it knows who should access it and how it should be protected. That's a good example of one that it's just not there today in the church, but how do we all unite together to influence the vendors to really further those capabilities? We are going to eventually shift away from the device to more of an after the world. The devices may not be managed 5 years from now, but we may just be focused on monitoring those and gathering that context data. So BYOD, whether folks think that we're ready for that now or not, 5 years from now, as more apps are externalized and running in the cloud, and there's less actually hosted on-prem potentially, BYOD may become a reality. And hopefully some of these security controls have come far enough to enable us to do that in a way that we're not taking on a bunch of risk for our company. The whole question about how much you trust cloud is still another big debate in the security industry. And some of it does depend on what industry your company in. If you're heavily regulated, a lot of the regulations and regulators still don't trust a lot of cloud environments as much. You have to go through a lot of extra work to get done there. So there's a higher barrier for some, but overall, how do we look at it in terms of there are things in our on-prem environment that we may not be happy with today. Is our environment as segmented as we'd like it to be? Do we do a good job of vulnerability management? Have we built in monitoring points along the way? So think about those things, those kind of sins of the past that have plagued us for a while, and build those in up front as you go to the cloud. So make the environment better when you get out there. Fully automate your builds with security checks as a part of the build process. Automate vulnerability management as a part of it. If you go to AWS, you could rebuild your entire environment every 24 hours. You know, that's not going to stop the hole that the attacker uses to get in, but it can address persistence and really slow them down and increase your chances of being able to catch them. So how do you think creatively about building those things in and really trying to do it the right way this time? If you talk about segmentation, if everything that was in your data center is spread amongst 15 cloud vendors, you've inherently built in segmentation. For an attacker, it will be more complicated than sending a phishing email today, hitting a user, and then being able to move laterally and get into the data center and hit multiple business systems. So it's just really shifting that mindset and looking at it differently and looking at if we're going to get there because it's just that effective from an economies of scale and cost for our business, how do we make the best of it? And how do we right a lot of the wrongs and mistakes that we may have made in the past? Decisions on managing risk and addressing cyber threats will be data-driven, and it's going to rely on analytics and automation. And we'll get into that a little bit more in one of the slides on analytics. But as you heard from Dimitri, there's less and less that attackers follow the security industry as well as we do. If we're all focused on rolling out anti-malware products, they're going to focus on getting away from malware and going to something else we're not looking at. So how do we start to use analytics to understand those behavioral changes and thresholds as additional context into all the other logic and make better decisions? And more in terms of control being relinquished, security teams might not control all of the security products and all of the controls throughout the environment. We're going to rely on several partners. So we've got to get better at how to document the requirements we want to put in place, lay out good, clear SLAs, and hold people accountable for everything. And how do you assess that and understand? And those aren't easy challenges, but how do we get after these before they're on top of us and we're caught trying to deal with them on the fly? Another thought from a risk-based perspective that we've seen is we actually brought together privacy, business continuity, and cybersecurity about a year ago. And I didn't anticipate some of the benefits that we saw in bringing those programs together. But if we look less at just the pure technical risk and start to bring together these programs, from the privacy perspective, we now know where a big chunk of our sensitive data is going to be stored at and what systems they're being stored on. From a recovery standpoint in the stages of the cybersecurity cycle, a big part of that is disaster recovery. If you've got a big enough breach or impact like Sony, you're in disaster recovery mode. So looking at these not as just security attacks, but they are actual incidents and sometimes disasters for companies. So how do you take that same planning approach and get business operations back up and running again? Looking at your business impact analysis as a part of your continuity program will tell you what IT systems are being used to support your most critical business processes. So the business is going to tell you, I need to be able to do this again in 4 hours. And you're going to have a mapping of all the IT systems that drive that. The goal would be, how do I protect those and watch those better than everything else I have? So take what's most important to the business and put some extra focus around that. And it can really help us prioritize where we spend a lot of our time trying to protect assets across the IT environment. And really, as you get into a lot of the response procedures, that all comes together. And it also allows us to plug into more of an enterprise response, which is we start to have to talk to the executive teams of the boards to influence them and build that credibility and support for our programs. You want to be able to talk about business risk and translate some of the vulnerabilities from the last conversation to what it actually means to the company. And plugging into enterprise risk management, crisis management before a big Sony attack happens will really help you be more prepared for a lot of that. The other thing you saw on the bottom there was the Intelligence Fusion Center, and Tony Kirk was in the audience, and when he was at Monsanto, he actually was one of the folks that helped found this. Tony and his peer running intelligence on the physical security side got together, started having some of our intel analysts sit together and really work together on what we were monitoring in terms of threats. And that gained traction and eventually ended up with our corporate engagement team who watches all the social media, looking for reputational issues, It ended up with scientific affairs and competitive intelligence. All those folks putting an intelligence analyst in one room together in kind of a mini SOC setting. And the value you get out of it is when you get an alert or a concern come out of the Fusion Center, it comes out of a fuller business context. So we can take better action because we don't just see that these 4 machines are malware infected, but are these 4 machines all part of the same business unit in the same region? And based on what might have been coming strategically from a business perspective, was that a more advanced attacker that knew that and was targeting them for IP? So it allows us to make better decisions knowing what's going on the business side because of that. The other thing we saw is very few of the incidents you see anymore are isolated to one side. So just a physical security issue or just a cybersecurity issue. You know, an example in St. Louis, if you look at some of the issues in Ferguson, it started with more of a physical event, but transitioned into a reputational event, and then eventually had cyber attacks coming along as some of the anonymous groups launched cyber attacks against the government elected officials and law enforcement groups. So, and we see this more and more where you may see a group of activist protests, which then is around DDoS attacks and turns into a media frenzy around reputational attacks. So the closer those groups work together, the more efficiently and rapidly you can respond and contain that. From a data-driven perspective, we've also seen that we have to become more agile and responsive as an organization. And some of it even starts with our planning. If I go back 10 years ago, when you sat down to build your security strategy, it looked a lot like a technology roadmap. You sat down and you said, well, next year we probably ought to go buy a firewall, and this year we need to go choose a new intrusion prevention product. And you sat down and you listed out the actual projects that you wanted to accomplish. The problem was it really wasn't tied to the business strategy or the IT strategy and where the company was going. And I think many companies have evolved to that point to say, okay, based on where we're going as a company, we're going to need these types of controls in place. And now it's really getting to the point of how do we really look at the data of the intelligence and who our adversaries are and how they're going to operate, what's the threat model in terms of how they're going to attack us. And then look at the data we have on how our controls perform and say, what are our weaknesses that we need to prioritize? And where else might our business strategy take us that we have vulnerabilities and gaps that we need to be ready for? Also, it's very difficult to do that on an annual planning cycle. So typically you kick off the year, you set your goals, everybody went about working on that, and then I find myself at the end of the year putting together our accomplishments, and half of the stuff we accomplished, it wasn't even on our radar at the beginning of the year. And based on business changes or something pops up, we were constantly taking on more things. But as a part of that, we were just pushing more down onto the people who already had a very full plate of things to do. So how do you start planning and reassessing priorities quarterly? And that may mean stopping certain things and putting more resources on something else so that you can get it done quicker and really enable what the business is looking to do. So it's a shift a bit in terms of how we look at meeting the needs of the company, responding to risks, and responding to really those IT changes and capabilities, and being much more proactive and not always responsive and just trying to do everything. Data and analytics, and we touched on this a bit earlier, but in terms of all of the investments we've already made in security products, all of us have a big pile of data sitting there, whether it's in a SIM or it's sitting in Splunk or somewhere. We're trying to use that data as best we can. And we get the alerts out of the products in terms of being known bad type of alerts. And the SIM is going to correlate things together and give you more proactive views. But overall, how do we get to analytics and start to look for what we're not seeing in the data and drive more value out of the other investments we've made by seeing things early? And we so often, when we do actually find something and we walk the trail back, we have the data to show us much earlier what's happening. We just didn't see it. And there's been a lot of discussions and several CISO roundtables I've been in on, is analytics really going to provide the value that we think it will? certain folks have taken a run at it and tried to do their best, but while it gives us some additional insights, has it really given us the value? Or are we expecting too much of it right away? And I think just looking at it and saying, the attackers are going to continue to move away from malware and other known bad attack vectors. You have the concerns around insider threat, especially if you're being targeted for corporate espionage. The only way to actually be able to catch some of that, especially somebody using a valid account inside your environment, is going to be looking at some of that behavioral-based analytics. And there are products that are coming out that are gaining traction and being able to drive some value there. So how do we embrace that as companies? And also think about the future, back to that other picture, around how do we monitor an environment that might be distributed across multiple cloud hosting vendors. If you don't have an egress point anymore in your network, that you're going to look at all traffic going out and look for C2 traffic. How are we going to catch that in the future? How do we correlate Gary Harbison's activity on-prem in a SaaS vendor in Office 365 or in all of these other platforms that are out there that companies may go to? And can you correlate that all together to get a complete picture of my activity across all of those environments? And really let us continue tomorrow and have the visibility that we've worked to build over the last few years. And then the people-centric aspect is one we spent a lot of time on. And as technical as the security industry is, it also comes down very much to people. Attackers go after people because they're the easiest way to get to technology. And typically the attack started with somebody clicking on something, somebody running something. And as hard as it is to do awareness, if we only throw technology at it, we're really only addressing half the problem. And I think some of it is, traditionally, we've structured awareness programs to be very generic. You lay out, you say, my goals for the year, I want to set out a quarterly newsletter, I'm going to put out 5 articles, 6 emails, I'm going to have an October security awareness month. If I do all those, I'm going to check the boxes and feel like I did a pretty good job. But all we've done is really bombard the employees with a bunch of generic security information that they just can't retain. It's not consistent, they're getting a bunch of articles, they don't understand half of it, and they really wonder, how does this really apply to me? So how do we take that and really shift it to say, based on understanding of our threats, and the strategy this year, which are those threats we're going to try and mitigate, we may be implementing technology solutions, but how do we also align an awareness program with that to be very focused on a set of key behaviors you want to try and change that year? If you're continuing to get APT-style attacks and you want to educate people on phishing, build the awareness program around that while you're also putting in the technical controls. And make it very specific, very consistent messaging around that. And build metrics to actually show whether you're getting the right behavior changes. And use that monitoring and those metrics to hold people accountable. When you have given them the direction and trained them on how to see those things, and you continue to see mistakes, there needs to be some accountability there. But if you start publishing things like the simulated phishing type of tests, most people are competitive, and most people don't want to do the wrong thing for their company. So give them a way and a target to improve on, but again, stay true to what your strategy is and what threats and behaviors you're trying to address that year. And we've seen that get a little more traction than just the generic blast of security information out to employees. The other side of the people approach is looking at the adversaries as people. And it's easy to lose sight of that because we get caught up in terms of the technical detail of the attacks. But in the end, the sophisticated adversary, there is somebody on the other end that has a set of intentions. They're after something specific, most likely, especially if you're dealing with a much more sophisticated adversary. And how do I position myself to have the best chance to address that? And this was just a concept, but trying to show that if you look at the amount of noise it takes to know somebody's in your environment, and that's very high, and if you're leaving easy doors open from vulnerability management issues and unpatched systems, misconfigured systems, your chances of success are going to be pretty low because you're going to let somebody have a whole lot of room to operate in your environment. And your chances of seeing that are low. that attacker is going to be relaxed. They're going to execute what they need to do, get what they need, and be done with it. So how do you start to make some of those changes, implement some of those controls, and to use the detect, detain, recover model? How do you start to raise the bar a little bit on how difficult it is to compromise your environment? Don't make it easy on them. Make them work a little bit harder. Then improve your detection capabilities and get to where you're sealing for kind of the noise of what you're going to see in the environment as well. If you can squeeze them in and really reduce that operating surface, you're going to have an increased ability to drive frustration on that side. They're very skilled, but they're not infallible. And if they get frustrated, they will make mistakes. And as long as you have the monitoring detection in there, you're going to have a better chance of seeing that than if you made it really easy on them and left a lot of the easy doors open and a lot of the basic stuff we've been trying to get good at for years. If you really understand the objectives and the intent, you reduce that operating system, you get increased frustration, and then you also can increase their opportunity cost. A lot of them are doing this as a career. This makes them money. So if they can take advantage of a vulnerability that's been out there for 5 years and you've never patched, it's much easier for them than if they have to burn a 0 day that's the effect of their intellectual property that has a value to them. So how do you make it a higher cost on them to come and attack your environment? How do you make it take longer for them, which means they're not able to go attack other targets? Or maybe they've got a paying customer that's going to push harder on them. So it kind of gets back into the approach of you've got to look at what they're trying to do and force them to operate differently. And it's going to increase your ability to do that. And it's driven us to take more of an approach on understanding the adversaries and who we're dealing with, because it does allow us to prioritize better. And the last aspect from a people perspective is really around talent. And I think there's two sides to that. One is, as security leaders, we need to get up every day thinking about talent. We're not going to be able to address all these challenges without the right people. So how do we help people develop, keep people challenged, reward people for the great work they're doing? You can't just think about these things when you have an open rec and you're trying to hire somebody. You have to think about them every day. How you sit with your team, you understand what they're working on, you understand what excites them, and try and build an environment that your team will get behind, that'll let you retain your best people, that'll let you look for creative ways to develop others, because it is going to be difficult to get talent. And it also will allow you to just continue to drive improved performance. A high-performing team is a team that people are going to want to be a part of. But sometimes, as leaders, we get caught up in the day-to-day and forget about that. You tend to only think about these types of things when you got to go hire somebody. And the other piece of it, I think, is what can we all do as an industry to help get additional people involved? How do you help develop and get non-security people to get involved in instrument function? How do we get to where we have more people that want to go into careers in security? How do you talk to high school students or even maybe grade school students and start to get them interested in it, so that we're not always trying to figure out how to staff our teams and culture each other? And it's going to take a shift from how we operate today to what we do tomorrow. And it's not just a company versus company, it's an industry problem. So with that, questions? Yes?
So I'm just wondering, in the last 2 years or so, what's the conversation for the C-suite? Is it changing for the better, or is it just creating more questions?
I think part of it depends on how the conversation is approached. And there's going to be certain industries, anyone in the healthcare industry after the anthem breach got very busy stuff. A big issue like that is going to generate a lot of concern at the board level. But typically, what the board is seeing is they're continuing to see this in the news over and over. And this is a very complex topic, and they understand they've got liability around making sure this is done correctly. So, as security people, being able to go in and take the complexity we deal with each day and simplify that in a way that they can understand it. Understand the threats we deal with and understand how we're addressing those, and really gain that the teams are focused on the right areas. That's really what is gonna build that. And anything you can do to help show your program, measure it, show where you're at against peers, and show where you're going and why. It gives them a way to get their arms around where you're at, where you need to improve, and how you're gonna get there. But overall, it's just what we've heard from board members is this is a difficult area for them to understand. And it's really up to the security professionals to help them get there and educate them and continue to really provide guidance along the way. So,
Your data-driven philosophy, when you talk about ERM and BYOD, it seems like its focus has shifted away from the endpoint. With the expert's ability to mimic behavior and even capture credentials of your trusted users, how can you achieve that balance of being data focused but not ignore the entry point into the data?
and I think some of that is based on now versus the future. I think now you have to stay at the endpoint. There's not the ability to gain that visibility or address those threats without being there. And right now, the endpoint space is one of the most crowded areas in terms of new products entering the marketplace in cybersecurity. And it's because that for a long time, I think we tried to get a lot of that visibility on the network because it was difficult to push out endpoint agent after endpoint agent and manage that, especially if you have a large global footprint endpoints. But I think you're seeing the shift back there because we couldn't get the detection and the fidelity of what we're trying to see at the network. So, but as things continue to progress, as BYOD may continue to progress along, we may not have that capability in the future. So it's trying to figure out how do we get the right visibility? How do we build in those controls if we assume that we may be able to monitor the endpoint, but we may not manage and push out all the security controls on it. So that was probably more of a forward-looking statement of thinking ahead in terms of what's coming and how we address it. I think so far most companies have understood when we've gone forward and said, here's the risk of BYOD and this is why it would be too early to get in there. But you can't tell that same story for 5, 6, 7 years over and over. Eventually they're going to look to us and say, what is the solution? And that's not necessarily us alone, that's us working with partners and working with vendors to put together that solution.
So you think
data classification is a tough one. I mean, I don't know that it's ever been rolled out 100% successfully at companies, at least that I talk to. I think people have pockets where they roll it out well in certain key data elements, and they may use data tagging to track some of that with DLP, but really getting it driven in where people can classify data, that's always been a struggle. A lot of people just don't think that way. Now there's some products that are coming out that you can configure to try and auto-classify certain types of data based on what it sees in the document or in the email. I mean, that may help us along as those products mature, if you can get it automated, but it's that people element of, can you train someone well enough to classify the data that would then allow us to make decisions on where it flows. But I think even to start, even if you could get a document with encryption, with authentication built in, can you do full authorization based on data type and tagging? I mean, that would be the best end goal, but I think we're still pretty far away from that.
yeah,
Any other questions? Thanks everybody for your time today. Appreciate it.